Okay, hi everyone, good afternoon or good morning if you are joining us from the United States. Welcome to the fourth event of Racism, Anti-Racism, the 2021-2022 seminar series, which is organized by the University of Genoa, PhD program in History, Art History and Archaeology in partnership with Centra, the Center for the History of Racism and Anti-Racism in Modern Italy. I'm really thrilled to kick off today's seminar, which draws on the fascinating book by Brian McLaren, Modern Architecture, Empire and Race in Fascist Italy, published in 2021 by Brill. And I truly thank the author for accepting our invitation. I would also like to thank our respondent, Hannah Malone, for being here and taking part in this talk. We are particularly delighted to discuss this monograph for a number of reasons. First of all, the book has the merit of approaching in an original and systematic way a topic that is as much evoked as not so much valued by the studies on the totalitarian politicization of architecture, urban planning, and archaeological excavations, starting from the classic contribution by Emilio Gentile about the fascist reinvention of the Romanità Fascismo di Pietra. I refer to the way, since the late 1930s, the political and scientific discourses on race impacted architecture and the built environment, to quote the author. The issue of how race and racist official ideology shaped urban design, at least in the intention of political elites, intellectuals, and experts, is a groundbreaking topic that perfectly meets Centra's interests about the history of racism and anti-Semitism in Italian mass culture and material culture too. A second point of interest is the book's purpose of historicizing this relationship between modernist and vernacular language in architecture, imperial imagination, racial building, eugenics, and racial sciences, by both investigating a varied range of sources and comparing what happened in colonies and in the context of the metropole. I mean, McLaren's book is an important contribution also because it deals with the relationship not under a generic timeless racialization paradigm. Finally, it goes without saying, a third point of interest is the multidisciplinary dimension of that work, its cross-cutting significance for a PhD program involving graduate students of different areas of studies, history, art history, and archaeology. And finally, let me say just a few words in order to introduce our two speakers. Brian McLaren is an associate professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington, Seattle, where he teaches history, theory, and methods classes and design. His scholarship has concentrated on the tension between architecture and politics in Italy and its colonies during the fascist regime, with recent attention to the intersection of modern architecture, empire, and racial politics. His initial publication concentrated on colonial Libya, and especially the relationship between modern architecture and local culture under the auspices of tourism. This research culminated in the book Architecture and Tourism in Italian Colonial Libya, an Ambivalent Modernism. Professor McLaren is currently working on a research project that examines the conflicted nature of mobility in Italian Africa, which expands upon his early research on architecture and tourism in Libya. Today's respondent, Hannah Malone, is an architectural historian working on fascism and memory in modern Italy. As assistant professor in contemporary history at the University of Groningen, she's now completing a book on Italy's fascist military sacrari of the First World War. Previously, she worked as a research fellow and lecturer at the British School at Rome, Magdalene College, Cambridge, Freie Universität and Max Planck Institute in Berlin. She's author of a monograph entitled Architecture, Death and Nationhood, and a prize-winning article on Republican legacy of Italy's fascist authorities in the First World War, published in Modern Italy, 2011. Now, without further ado, I would ask the participants, except the speaker, to switch off all the cameras and microphones in order not to overload the connection. Concerning the seminar's organization, Professor McLaren will speak first for about 40 minutes. Then it will be the turn of Professor Malone. And after that, Brian, if you like, you are free to respond to Anna's comments. Then I will open the debate. For the audience, please use the function hand raised or write in the chat in order to speak during the Q&A session, and only unmute yourself when it's your turn. So thank you again for your attention. I leave the floor to our speaker, Professor McLaren, and thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll start with screen share now. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So before beginning, I'd like to thank the members of Centra for the invitation to be part of this seminar series. Very honored to present my work to this group, and especially grateful to Matteo for preparing me for the event, and actually as well for the kind introduction. I also want to thank Hannah Malone for being respondent to the book presentation. I very much look forward to this conversation and to the participation of the audience. I'd also like to briefly recount the origins of this project and some much earlier research findings, as well as speak to the methods of my research. During the course of my dissertation, I discovered some documents at the Historic Archive in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that related to the residents of the so-called Indigenous Villages at the Mostra del Mare in Napoli. This material became part of a section of my dissertation that dealt with colonial exhibitions. Another early source was found at Widener Library at Harvard University, where I came across the journal DAFIST della Razza, which gained my interest for its presentation of research on Italy's African colonies under the auspices of racial science. This material eventually informed my views on the discourse of local culture within the tourist system in Libya. In addition to these early sources, this project has been founded in a much less conventional research activity. As this project came together, I was active in acquiring a number of the key publications, publicity brochures, and photographs, the two central objects of study, the Esposizione Universale di Roma and Mostra Triennale della Terra Italiana d'Oltremare. As with other major research projects that I've conducted, my scholarship is founded in the material culture of the time. In presenting this book project, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art at Washington, D.C., where I was a visiting senior fellow, and the Graham Foundation for the Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, which awarded me a research and development grant. I would also like to recognize the staff at the various archives where I did my research, including the Central State Archives in Rome, Historic Archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Historic Archive of the Accademia Nazionale di San Luca, Historic Archive of the Mostra d'Oltremare, and the Federico Parlani Archive in the Museo Fotografico Contemporaneo in Cinecella Balsamo. I'd also like to thank the editorial board of the Spatial Practices book series Aprile, headed by Christoph Eland of the Universität Paderborn, for accepting my proposal for this book project, and the staff at Brill, especially senior editor Krista Stevens, for working me through the review process and manuscript submission. I will now provide a broad summary of the key arguments of the book, combined with a sampling of some of its most important images. This book explores the relationship between modern architecture, empire, and race during a tumultuous period of Italian history. In much of the existing scholarship, the architectural production of this time has either been ignored or theorized as a relatively direct expression of the fascist regime's political ideology, although even this work has avoided discussing its racist policies. In addressing this historical gap, this book examines the discourse on Italian architecture as a mediation of the racial constructs that emerged following the invasion and occupation of Ethiopia and intensified in the latter part of the decade and into the wartime. In this effort, it argues that the most powerful political and cultural assertions, and particularly those in the realm of art and architecture, arose from a fearful and reactive need to assert a pure Italian identity against the threat of international, foreign, or Jewish influences. It further contends that fascism's racial policies were a product of fear and weakness rather than strength, and that the architecture of the period bore the mark of this combative stance. In exploring the architecture of the late fascist era, this research asserts that the discourse on identity, and in particular the vehemence of its drive toward an authentic Italian expression, was directly impacted by the fascist state's imperial encounters in Africa. Through considering this broader imperial context, this architecture is examined in relation to an aggressive and racially motivated politics. However, rather than studying the intersection of modern architecture, empire, and race through actions taken in Italy's colonies, it does so through the reflection of those activities back in Italy. The argument being that concerns for racial prestige that existed in Italian East Africa and policies that developed for their amelioration were also found at home. This study is conducted through a wide-ranging examination of two highly significant state-sponsored exhibitions: the 1942 Esposizione Universale di Roma, or E42, and the 1940 Mostra Triennale delle Terre Italiane d'Oltremare, or Mostra d'Oltremare. In selecting these large-scale events, this book follows the pioneering research of Robert W. Rydell, which looks at American international expositions as public spectacles, where the idea of technological and national progress became laced with scientific racism. In the case of the E42, which was never held due to the wartime conflict, this officially sanctioned world exposition was intended to assert the historical and contemporary importance of Italian society and culture on a world stage, an effort that aimed to legitimize Mussolini's geopolitical ambitions. This symbolic importance, combined with the fact that its construction continued from October 1937 through August 1943, makes the Rome Exposition a compelling example of the changing climate for state sponsorship, as it was impacted by the political circumstances of the time. In comparison, the Mostra d'Oltremare, held in Naples in May 1940 and cut off by the war in June, was a powerful demonstration of fascist imperialism, organized to represent the historical, geographic, and commercial significance of Italy's overseas possessions. In pursuing this agenda, this first of a planned series of triennial events openly engaged Italy's imperial and racial identity, presenting its activities abroad to a largely national audience. While the national profile of the Neapolitan exhibition gave it a secondary status relative to the Rome event, it nevertheless offers a complex rendering of the fascist regime's vision of empire. These exhibitions are studied as they were in their time, initially as programs, proposals, and competition schemes, during the process of construction as work sites and partially or fully completed buildings, and as the war progressed as inhabited, abandoned, or reappropriated sites. They are examined in relation to the evolving discourse that saw Mediterranean racial theories that argued that race was tied to culture and environment, and Aryan Nordic ones that asserted that race was linked solely to biology, eventually give way to a spiritualist view that contended that the violence of war was the highest affirmation of the Italian race. In so doing, this research engages a wide range of historical material to assemble what can best be understood as an incomplete narrative of the architecture of the late fascist era. It nevertheless works at the juncture between the various political speeches and works of legislation, journal article, critical essays, philosophical texts, letters, and jury comments to explore the manner in which these various political and cultural constructs were mediated through the architecture of the period. The book is ordered chronologically to provide a broad understanding of the impact of the changing circumstances of these exhibition sites, and divided into three sections according to the three major racial constructs of the time: Mediterranean, Aryan, and spiritualist. Part 1 sketches out the trajectory of how racial antagonism and fear related to Italy's Mediterranean identity shaped the urban spaces of these prominent exhibition sites. It does so against the backdrop of the emerging discourse on race within urban planning, such as in Mussolini's favoring of the millenarian monuments of Roman and early Christian periods in Rome. The idea of Rome as a racial landscape can be seen in the presentation of its ancient monuments for the 1938 state visit of Adolf Hitler, where a purified experience of the ancient past was fused with fascist and Nazi-inspired expressions of power. A second key example, which is especially exemplary of the discourse on race in urban planning, is the master plan of Addis Ababa, which was grafted over the heart of ancient rule. In so doing, the master plan was to be organized to create spatial hierarchies that were tied to racial, religious, and class-based identities of both colonial and Italian subjects. The combination of a rigid hierarchical order and a dispersal of the city into the landscape would have created a deurbanized colonial city. In this effort, the social and spatial order of the master plan would combine with the logic of surveillance to produce a highly ordered and racially segregated colonial city plan. The organizational and administrative foundations of the Esposizione Universale di Roma were established in the 2 years immediately following the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The formation of this event was based upon a report prepared for Mussolini in April 1935 by Giuseppe Bottai, then governor of Rome, and Federico Pinabercet, general director of the annual Padua Trade Fair. Among the key themes that originated from this time was the idea of the E42 establishing a symbolic and physical connection between Rome and the sea, which was a direct allusion to fascism's imperial ambitions in the Mediterranean. Equally important was that the core of the exposition was to be found in a monumental center of permanent buildings that would be an architectural expression of Roman civilization and of fascism. This process culminated with the selection of the site in the Tre Fontane area near the Ponte Maliana, a site that was considered a fatal piece of land of divine inspiration. This idea was shown through an elaborate foundation ceremony in April 1937 that saw the planting of 3 pine trees on the site. This effort, as an act of racial purification, the presence of long-term residents was erased in favor of a Christian and Roman past that was being revived under the auspices of this Olympics of civilization. In considering the master plan of the E42, the initial proposal of 1937 was prepared by a team that included well-established architects, Marcello Piacentini and Giuseppe Pagano, along with 3 members of the new generation of rationalist architects. In responding to the representational program of the event, the plan attempts to balance its status as a monumental complex with the new and modern values of the time, seen in the loose arrangement of buildings in the landscape. However, soon after the approval of the plan, the implementation phase began, which saw the creation of a new program that suggested a more hierarchical arrangement reflecting the sense of Rome. The parallel process of the Mostra d'Oltre Mare was the result of a long-standing ambition of the fascist government to create a permanent colonial exhibition. In its essential directive to present the historical and contemporary status of Italy's colonies, the Mostra d'Oltre Mare took a decidedly hybrid approach. It pursued a representational mission that included the kinds of imperial demonstrations that were typical to Italy's participation in international, national, and regional venues, thereby conveying its expansionist political ambitions alongside its modernizing activities abroad. In addition, it offered a carefully framed presentation of indigenous cultures, including the literal recreation of colonial environments. The identity of the Mostra d'Oltre Mare was also tied to the rich historical association of its location in the Fuori Grotta area of Naples, widely understood as a highly charged mythological landscape whose Roman legacy reflected its explicitly imperial and African significance. Its foundation was marked in a similar manner to the E42, with the planting of 4 palm trees in June 1938. This public event marked the beginning of the construction process that would culminate with the opening of the exhibition in May 1940. The master plan of the Mostra d'Oltre Mare was directly connected to its representational mission. The exhibition was divided into 3 distinct zones: a historical sector that was to document the history of conquest and civilization of ancient Rome within the Mediterranean, a production sector which was to illustrate the infrastructure and general improvements introduced by Italy and its colonies, and a geographic sector that was intended to present Italy's colonial lands in their architectural and cultural environment. In taking this decidedly hybrid approach, the Mostra d'Oltre Mare offered a carefully organized collection of colonial and metropolitan spaces. The changing attitudes to urban planning in Italy and its colonies was shaped by the onset of the racial campaign in June 1938. These changes were related to the transposition of colonial racial attitudes to Italy, seen in the annual celebration of the founding of the Italian Empire in Rome. The representation of racial harmony between Italian and African troops at such events masked the truth of racial strife, as the presence of East Africans in Italy was irreconcilable with the political and social climate of the time. The impact of such racialized spatial practices on the master plans of the E42 and Mostra d'Oltre Mare was seen in the increasing attention paid to the creation of spatial orders that directly reflected the racial hierarchies of the times. While the second master plan of the E42 achieves a more severe, square, and Roman character, at the Mostra d'Oltre Mare, the master plan was intended to convey a strong sense of the separate identity of each of the main sectors, which were categorized according to colonial.
Excuse me, Brian, you are mute.
We don't hear.
The whole time?
Okay, now I can hear you.
No, just a few words. Just a few
okay.
words.
Just this slide or the previous one?
The previous one.
Okay, sorry
Thank
about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Not sure how that happened. So did you hear any of this one?
Yes, the beginning of this one.
just the beginning. The representation of racial harmony between Italian and African troops at such events masked the truth of racial strife, as the presence of East Africans in Italy was irreconcilable with the political and social climate of the time. The impact of such racialized spatial practices on the master plans of the E42 and the Mostra d'Oltremare was seen in the increasing attention paid to the creation of spatial orders that directly reflected the racial hierarchies of the times. While the second master plan of the E42 achieves a more severe square and Roman character, at the Mostra d'Oltremare, the master plan was intended to convey a strong sense of the separate identity of each of the three major sectors, which were categorized according to colonialism's hierarchies. Despite their differences, one of the more striking facets of the implementation of these master plans was the re-territorialization of their sites as racially encoded landscapes. At the Mostra d'Oltremare, the geographic sector involved the transplantation of indigenous African plant species, as well as the instantiation of the hierarchies that would define the relationship between metropolitan and colonial lands. At the E42, in an effort to reenact Italy's Roman identity, an exhibition of Italian gardens employed flora donated and transported from the various provinces of Italy. In so doing, these exhibitions territorialized the racial disquiet of the time and the identity of the Roman and Neapolitan countryside that merged with other places and races, Mediterranean, African, and Baltic. Part 2 explores how the discourse on eugenics during the Italian racial campaign found its analog in architecture and the arts. Between September 1938 and July 1939, a series of legislative policies were put in place that led to limitations on marriage, as well as constraints in the fields of education, the national economy, the Italian military, and all sectors of the government. The consequence of these and many other racially motivated political measures was that the fascist state moved away from espousing a Mediterranean racial identity and toward asserting the Nordic and Aryan origins of the Italian people, thus conjoining Italian racial politics and that of German National Socialism. In reflecting on the problem of modern art as it was discussed during the Italian racial campaign, there emerged two distinct lines of critique by conservative commentators. One that focused on the artist as bourgeois, Jewish, and decadent, and a second that concentrated on the artwork itself, on its ebraizzazione, that is, its racial impurity. This critical debate was actualized through fascist bureaucracies whose responsibility it was to control or otherwise judge artistic production. Considering the predominance of realism and themes of rural life in the artworks of the time, it appeared that, under the direct impact of the regime, artistic taste in Italy in the late 1930s was being shaped eugenically. Just as in the arts, the reactionary decisions that defined the identity of a modern architecture for the fascist state, which eventually led to a racially charged idea of ancient renewal, were strictly applied by members of the various state bureaucracies that presided over public projects, as well as the juries that were part of this public competition process. As a result, architectural taste during the late fascist era was similarly shaped along eugenic lines. At the Esposizione Universale di Roma, a series of 5 major public competitions were held for the most important permanent buildings and public spaces. Viewed together, the design of these key buildings and spaces provided substance to the broad visions that were proposed in the master plan. The selection of the major permanent buildings at the E42 largely followed the same competition processes that were already in place for public buildings throughout Italy. The competition process can thus be thought of as a proxy for the racial laws, as the juries called for significant changes, and the selected projects were further transformed under the watchful eye of the Architecture, Parks, and Gardens Service of the anti-E42. These projects included the Piazza dei Ricevimenti e Congressi by Adalberto Libera, and the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana by Guarini, La Padula, and Romano, both of which eventually sought a more accentuated classicism, founded through the use of certain materials, through well-defined architectural elements, through symmetry and proportions. The final example is the competition for the design of the Piazza ed Edifici delle Forze Armate, which called for the design of 3 separate buildings, one for each branch of the armed forces, that would frame a shared urban space. Notably, the competition spanned 2 stages and eventually led to the award of the project to 2 different architect teams, headed by Mare Dorenzi and Gino Pollini, who were asked to work together. This competition process led the project to more closely follow the guidance of the call for entries, which asserted that the foundation of the architectural inspiration must be the classical and monumental feeling, in the pure sense of the attitude of the spirit, a desire that can be seen as a reification of the eugenic principles that contended that a pure Italian identity could be determined biologically. Well, a similar, though less publicly celebrated process took place at the Mostra d'Alto Mare. Competition proposals took a divergent path. The buildings were not subject to the same pressure to conform to a single aesthetic approach, and instead were proposed as a heterogeneous collection of buildings. This expressive range was largely due to the fact that, as previously noted, the site was divided into 3 distinct zones. With the historical sector, its pavilions pursued a subtle historicism that matched the sequence of the displays, while with the production sector, the buildings explored a vernacular Mediterranean language as the face of Italian industry and commerce through the empire. The final zone, the geographic sector, had the task of representing the architecture and landscape of Italy's colonies, and it did this through a series of eclectic buildings referencing the various indigenous traditions set within an equally representative parkscape. One of the most extensive and complex explorations of racial hierarchy in the geographic sector was the Libyan Pavilion designed by the architect Florestano di Fausto, who was already well known for his projects through the Mediterranean and especially in Libya. The Mediterranean architecture of di Fausto pursued a form of contextualism that attempted to absorb the characteristic forms as well as the building traditions of the local architecture. In the case of the Libyan Pavilion, he was called upon to establish a hierarchy within the broader exhibition setting, thereby creating a taxonomy of racial prestige that had a clear didactic intention. In addition, not unlike the racially motivated research of anthropologists and ethnographers, its interior displays presented Libyan culture in a manner that effectively consigned the local populations to a timeless interpretation of their past. With the onset of the Italian racial campaign, not only was an intense debate conducted concerning the identity of modern Italian architecture that intimately connected it to the issue of race, but also it provided the rationale for an already well-established fascist policy of autarky. In this process, the stylistic restrictions that were imposed by the jury process and the input of the NT42 were compounded through material restrictions that asked architects to avoid the use of steel and concrete and instead work with local materials. In the final development of what became the Edifici dell'Autarchia, del Cooperativismo e della Previdenza Sociale, the use of reinforced concrete that in Italian rationalism was an icon of modern architecture had surrendered to a trabeated construction comprised of fully embodied travertine columns and an interior masonry structure. As such, it would seem that the creative void that opened up within Italian society as a product of the fascist pursuit of cultural and material autarky had resulted in the complete loss of the expressive qualities of contemporary architecture. A similar aesthetic trajectory is followed in the development of a sculptural group on an agrarian theme by the Milanese artist Fausto Melotti for the Edifici dell'Autarchia. Over the course of its development, it evolved from a roughly hewn expressive work into a more limpidly classical expression, suggesting that it was impossible to avoid the demand to express Italy's ancient sources. Reflecting on this development and on the artwork of Melchiorre Melis in the Libyan Pavilion, it would seem that in the face of the threat of international influence, as well as the danger of miscegenation by Italy's indigenous other, architecture and art were pushed to recapture a mythic past, whether that past be Italian or Libyan. Part 3 explores the continuing evolution of these exhibitions as fascist Italy's belligerent geopolitical stance, as well as its increasingly contentious racial politics, inexorably drew it into World War II. This discussion is set against the backdrop of a wartime discourse that also penetrated the field of architecture, which saw the emergence of what was called anti-aircraft urbanism. At the same time, in the field of art, Giuseppe Bottai, who was then Minister of National Education, spoke of the artistic evolution during the fascist period as a battlefield, as a revolution, an ideological work free of rhetoric that would fight for the existence of Italian art. Such arguments signaled the emergence of a wartime mentality that paralleled the evolving politics of the time. This discourse is closely tied to the spiritualist racial arguments of the Italian philosopher Julius Evola, who sought a metaphysical justification for war. The fusion of racial politics and war found in the spiritualist racism of Evola represented a new phase in the evolution of racial thinking during the fascist era. This attitude profoundly shaped the built environment through a variety of means, from the conception of space to the organization of construction processes and various appropriations of space due to the wartime conditions. The wartime built environment, especially as it was impacted by the military conflict, was thus a testament to the biopolitics of the wartime, which saw the amplification and release of the latent qualities of spiritualist racism in the form of mental and physical aggression. In the development of the E-42 through the later 1930s and into the wartime, of particular importance is the idea of the exhibition as a site of labor. Especially important to this examination is a highly staged visit to the construction site by Mussolini in April 1939, where incomplete buildings like the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana became a backdrop to this display. The description of the event in Il Messengero was especially focused on the fierce activity on the site, with allusions to the militarization of Italian society. This was the most widely publicized and elaborate of these highly orchestrated public events, which in this case prominently featured the immense scale of the project and the unselfish dedication of its workers. When looking at the map of the itinerary, it is clear that rather than offering a spatial sequence that would simulate the experience of the site, the route was intended to create a thematic sequence which moved from spiritual foundations to the idea of empire tied to the history of Italian culture, and finally the contemporary strengths of fascism in the areas of physical and intellectual labor. The last of these themes, and especially that of physical labor and the worker, was quite poignantly demonstrated in the visit to the Villagio Aprile. Although located outside the boundaries of the master plan, it provided what was arguably the most memorable and representative experience. The Villagio Aprile was constructed to house temporary laborers who traveled to Rome to work on the exhibition. However, despite the appearance of a benevolent social program, the workers were kept in a form of compulsory isolation that placed them under wartime conditions before the war began. A similar presentation is offered at the Mostra d'Oltremare, whose inauguration by King Vittorio Emanuele III took place 8 months after the beginning of World War II, just over a month before Italy joined the war. Notably, this was not the only significant public ceremony on that day, with powerful historical and political overtones. In Rome, Mussolini presided over the celebration of the Annuale dell'Impero, with news reports conveying an image of public spectacle at a massive scale. In Naples, the king was accompanied by an impressive entourage of guests. After a brief and solemn ceremony to open the exhibition to the public, the king completed what one news report called a pilgrimage of faith through the centuries of our luminous civilization. However, rather than a religious pilgrimage, the carefully chosen itinerary through Italy's imperial past, and the constant presence of armed Italian and African soldiers more closely resembled a well-rehearsed military exercise. This aspect was especially evident in a number of the buildings and spaces, such as the exhibition of armed forces, whose rational forms were used to frame a virtual field of battle. Also important were the indigenous villages, which were an informal arrangement of buildings constructed by a group of East Africans who were brought from their homelands for this event. While this was not the first Italian colonial representation to create an indigenous village, it did so with an attention to detail that was unprecedented. Although the workers lived in the village on the grounds of the exhibition during the daytime, enacting their cultural practices for the benefit of a tourist audience, in the evening they lived in a former barracks, which was in its own way a setting for their daily lives. After Italy entered World War II on June 10, 1940, these exhibition sites were transformed in profound ways. At the Mostra d'Oltremare, in reaction to a climate of racial fear, the East African inhabitants were not allowed to move freely in the city or live in proximity to Italians. As a result, the Eritreans, Somalian, and Ethiopian workers and their families who came to the Villagio Indigeni, as well as the East African soldiers that were hired to be their guards, became confinati. Just like these political prisoners, the presence of the inhabitants of the Villagio Indigeni was incommensurable with the Italian racial laws as they were enforced on the conditions of war. In this wartime context, the larger site of the Mostra d'Oltremare was a space of confinement, a concentration camp. In 1943, the group of East Africans were moved due to the ongoing wartime activities, spending 15 months in the countryside of central Italy, where their eventual fate was tragically enmeshed with the end of the Allied military campaign to liberate Italy. There was a parallel manifestation of spatial violence on the site of the E42. The work on the permanent buildings and site improvements continued after Italy's entry into World War II, though it did so at a slower pace. Despite the efforts of the organizers, the wartime conditions led to the cessation of all construction activities and eventually various forms of reappropriation of the site. One example was an orto di guerra, or war garden, which was used to provide agricultural products during a time of limited resources. With the end of all construction activity in August 1943 and the capture of Rome a month later, this unfinished and abandoned Olympics of civilization became a cadaverous backdrop to military conflict and an encampment for the German occupation. And considering the full significance of the final days of the fascist regime in Italy, it is in relation to such conjunctions of war and violence that Michel Foucault speaks about the emergence of a new racism modeled on war. According to this view, while one of the goals of state-sponsored racism was the destruction of other races, it was also necessary for such regimes to expose its own race to the absolute and universal threat of death. In a statement that almost exactly parallels the arguments of Julius Evola, Foucault argues that for totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, exposing the entire population to universal death was the only way it could truly constitute itself as a superior race and bring about its definitive regeneration. The story of the buildings and sites of the Esposizione Universale di Roma and the Mostra Triennale delle Terre Italiane d'Oltremare, leading up to and continuing through the wartime, reveals the inevitable consequences of this manner of racial thinking. As this book argues, the unique combination of fear, belligerence, and racial intolerance were indirectly manifested in architectural and artistic culture, as well as in the formation of the broader built environment. However, in examining the territorialization of race in urban plans, the eugenic practices of design judgment, and the redefinition of architectural environments amid the violence of war, this research does not offer a singular and unchanging basis by which to interpret the architecture of a troubling period of Italian history. Instead, it aims to open a new historical panorama by examining how architecture, art, and urban space, the politics and culture that encompass them, the processes that form them, and the society that experienced them were racialized in varying and complex ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brian, for your thought-provoking presentation full of ideas. Now, before opening the discussion, I give the floor to Hannah for your response.
Yes, thank you, Matteo. Thank you to Matteo and to everyone at Centra for organizing this. But above all, thank you to Brian for writing such a rich and thought-provoking book. What I'm going to do is to highlight two core ideas in this book, and then to raise some questions relating to those two core themes. So the first theme I'd like to talk about is, of course, race. And the way this book approaches race is particularly innovative and timely, I think. It's innovative because there has perhaps been a reluctance to look at race in Italian history broadly, and more specifically in Italian architecture. And this book, in that sense, is truly groundbreaking in opening up new areas, new investigations into race. But the book's also timely because I think it reflects a new awareness around race, but perhaps on a global level across culture, but also specifically in Italy, looking at how race is reflected in Italian national identity and political culture. And I'd like to mention some ways in which this book's approach to race is particularly interesting. One is in how it inverts the focus. So quite often when we tend to think about race under fascism, we look at how ideas around race went from the center to the periphery. So how ideas that emerged in Rome, in the metropole, were then applied in the colonies. And this book is interesting in how instead it looks at how ideas around race and colonial imperialism had an effect back at home, how these ideas were actualized, how they were embodied in, for instance, the exhibition sites back on Italian soil. And I think that's interesting in shifting our attention back to Italy and looking at how racial ideas had an impact specifically on Italian identity, not only on how Italy acted abroad and in the Italian colonies. This book is also interesting in the way it underlines how racial policy under fascism came from a sense of fear, as Brian mentioned, from irrational feelings of disgust and hatred. So this is policy that emerges not from a strong regime that is becoming increasingly authoritarian with the passage of time and with the shift towards war, but rather from the opposite, from a regime in crisis. And specifically how ideas around race come from a sense of insecurity and from perhaps an Italian sense of inferiority, which is tied to a search for an Italian identity. And although many of the themes that Brian addresses in this book are quite specific to fascism, We can, of course, trace these processes to the period before fascism, to the origins of Italy in the 19th century, and to a much broader sense of what does it mean to be Italian? Well, what is the Italian identity? Which is reflected in architecture, in a search for an Italian style, for a national style, which has much deeper roots, which predates fascism, but then reaches, in a sense, its apex under fascism, its culmination. And Brian also emphasizes how fascist racial policy is fundamentally anti-modern, reactionary and progressive. And this is specifically because it comes from a feeling of crisis, from a position of fear rather than of strength. This book also shows how ideas around race are not static, but they are evolving. They are not monolithic, but they are fragmentary. Brian shows quite clearly how there were different competing visions of race under fascism that went in and out of fashion, how there were in particular 3 strands, which he then uses very effectively to structure this book into 3 parts. And this is interesting, I think, in 2 ways. First, because it shows the inherent contradiction within fascist ideology. It shows the conflicts, the fractures in the fascist dictatorship. It shows the messiness at times of fascism. It is also interesting because it shows how ideas around race are fragmentary, conflicted, they are ever-changing, and that we need to have a much more nuanced and complex understanding of race. And Brian says quite clearly that this area that he's looking at is a field of research that is still new. It's still in its infancy, and that race in the Italian context, in the fascist context, needs more attention. And this book shows how looking at culture, and specifically at architecture, can give us a very interesting way of looking at race beyond looking specifically at political policy, how actually looking at culture can be a very good way into understanding the politics. So this brings me on to the second core theme that I would like to underline in this book. And this is the relationship between architecture and politics, and particularly political policies around race, that is at the heart of the book. Now, Brian shows quite clearly how politics had a direct and immediate impact upon architecture. Something happened in the political world and bam, something in accordance to that happened in architecture. And how political ideas, political policy had an impact on architecture, but also the way politics changed the material conditions immediately affected architecture. But this book, I think, is particularly effective in the way that it shows that politics impacts architecture, but architecture also impacts politics. And what I mean by that is that architecture also supports political power. To draw on Foucault's ideas of disciplinary power, architecture is part of what maintains power, it's part of what sustains a political order. If you can control built space, you can control the people that inhabit that space. And this book shows quite clearly how a particular political order, a particular racial hierarchy was supported and maintained through architecture. So this book is effective in using architecture and urban planning as a way to make manifest, to reveal political ideas, to show, to use architecture as a way to highlight particular visions around race, But it's also effective because it emphasizes how the relationship between politics and architecture always goes two ways. This is particularly innovative because there are two main approaches in the literature on fascist era architecture. There is some of that literature which tends to treat architecture under fascism as something quite separate from the political world. But then there is also, as Brian mentioned in the book and in his talk, there is also literature that looks at architecture purely in political terms, or purely as a product, a reflection of political policy. I think this book looks at the relationship between politics and architecture in a much more sophisticated way, because it avoids falling into the trap of over-determinism. It shows how architecture is not a perfect mirror for politics, but it is a mediating force, that it can embody political ideas. So I think in avoiding the pitfalls of that occur in some of the literature on fascist era architecture, this book puts architecture back in its proper position, and is very, very effective in showing how, as historians or as art historians, and I know that there are PhD students from a variety of disciplines at this seminar, how we, as researchers, how we can use architecture and the built environment as a way of exploring history, and as a way of exploring particularly the political world. And in so doing, Brian's book also avoids another myth within the architecture, within the literature on fascist architecture, which, as Brian mentions in the text, is that the great modernist architects of the fascist regimes, such as Terragni or Libera, the ones who have gotten a lot of attention in the literature, that their search for modern architecture was in fact a subtle way to resist the regime, which is not true. And I think this book is very effective in showing quite the opposite, how deeply tied architecture and politics were under the regime. So drawing on these two key themes, I'd like now to raise three questions, and I'm addressing these questions to Brian, but I'm hoping they could be points of discussion more widely. My first question is about the role of individuals. Now, following Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks, Brian asserts how art gains meaning from its context, not simply from the intentions of individual artists. So this book looks at architecture as a product of politics and culture, not simply coming from the minds of specific architects. But I want to ask Brian about the role of individuals. What role do individuals, such as specific architects, play in this story? And I'm thinking particularly about individuals such as Carlo Enrico Rava, who features quite prominently, who's very interesting as both a victim and a promoter of racial discrimination, and various individuals who are interesting because they have been erased from history. Some of them, not all of course, but some of them have fallen into oblivion because their reputations were tainted by associations with fascism. So essentially I'm asking, how important were these individuals in shaping political policy? Were they true believers? Were they opportunists? Does it matter what they think? Okay, that was my first question. My second question is about connections with today. I think this is a very relevant book, particularly given the increase in racial tensions in today's world, but also given the constraints that are now being put on artistic freedom, censorship in various parts of the world. And I particularly like to focus on two aspects, which is the role of race in shaping Italian identity in ways that persist until today, and how the physical legacy of fascist architecture represents a heritage that endures until today. Fascist buildings such as the Mostre, of course, survive today, and they are symbolic, they are representative of the way fascist memories persist in Italian consciousness and in the spaces of everyday life in Italy. In the conclusion of this book, there is a fascinating section which talks about what happened to the exhibitions after the end of the Second World War, after the fall of fascism. And you can see how the Mostre exemplify, in a way, what happened to the legacy of fascism in post-war Italy, and how, of course, there was some change, particularly in the way that the identity of these Mostre was changed. It was changed away from a nationalist imperialist identity towards a more internationalist view of Italy's role in the world. But the afterlife of these two Mostre is also emblematic of the continuity, or of the degree to which fascist memories or fascist traces have remained in Italy in some forms. So essentially, I want to ask, how does this book speak to today, particularly around the legacy of fascism and ideas of race developed under fascism that leave a trace today? And finally, my third question is about new avenues of research. As I mentioned earlier, I think this book could be among the first in a growing field of research, because it opens up new directions of study. And I think particularly two directions could be interesting relating to the two core themes. New work in race is certainly necessary, but also new work that uses architecture as a way of exploring the world of politics could also be interesting. And I'm asking this question really for me, but also for any PhD students or researchers who are thinking about what to work on in the future. So essentially, my third question is, where do we go from here? I'm curious what Brian's next project will be, but also more broadly, what he thinks other scholars should work on, following in his footsteps, if you like. So those were my three questions on the role of individuals, legacy in the present day, and finally, new avenues for research. So having thrown out those three questions, I will pass this back to Brian, and thank you again for writing this book, which is a very fun read, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Really thoughtful comments, and yeah, the first question about the role of individuals is interesting, because I do, Rav in particular, I have a longer history of research related to him. I've met his daughter a number of years ago, actually, and got, images from his travels in Libya and in Africa. I believe his daughter has actually died since then, but this was back when I was doing my dissertation. So I have a close relationship to him in terms of research. I've also even written about the post-war Rav as a figure in a separate publication, Rav as a figure to the fascist era, and what happened to him after World War II, because I think it's really fascinating And I was generally interested in some of these figures when I was writing it, in a sense that, and some of them, like Mare de Renzi, is not one of the, in the pinnacle of architects. He's not in the club, well-known Italian architects during the fascist era. He was slightly older. He teamed up with Adalberto Libera was a younger colleague, and they did some work together. This was De Renzi. The project at the E42 was the thing that he worked with Pollini and Figini. And again, he was a relatively lesser known figure. But I do think there is another story, and I resisted only in that last part. And I actually, at one point, I had an even longer conclusion where I told a number of the individuals, like Bottai is a figure that threads through this project, which consistently appeared in various episodes, right? Rava and others, right? So I was interested in Piacentini, of course, as both, sort of early figure in the planning of the E42, and then eventually some of the discord between him and Pagano that happened after about 1938, 1939, and Pagano's break from, but I resisted the biography part of the history. That's not to say that there wasn't, these individuals aren't acting, but I took seriously the call of Gramsci to say that too often the historicizing of architecture falls on the author and on the genius of the individual. And I really did want to look at these, in some cases, incredibly ordinary buildings that no historian of architecture would want to talk about because they're frankly not that great. But it's not about the aesthetics of the building. It's about how they existed in a certain kind of cultural panorama. To be honest, I was also fascinated with the fact that I did a good chunk of my research at the Central State Archive, and I was writing about the building of the Central State Archive in an archive that had millions of documents about its history, so I could find the most obscure facts about its construction. So I was really immersed in the construction process of the buildings. Certainly along the way, the individuals' correspondences and such came in, but the history that I told focused on what took place, the building of the building, not even the publication of the building. So the broader sphere in which these buildings existed, not separate from the authors, but in a sense, independent in some ways of the authors, including the reception, destruction, the completion after the war. All these things to me were fascinating. So I think it is an important history that could be told, and I could probably write an essay on just that, right? But I kept it to this. Connections with today are really interesting. Coincidentally, when I was working on this project, I was invited to a seminar at the Buell Center in New York that was about Trump, basically. It was basically the problem of Trump in America and his sort of weighing in some cases on architecture, right? Coincidentally, all of the scholars that they brought in were scholars of fascism, were either scholars of American architecture or fascism. So there's no question that in that presentation, I sort of availed myself of Gramsci's writing about Caesarism. And I'm not sure if you've read, it's a really short piece in his prison notebooks on Caesarism. I read that as a sort of explanation for Trump, right? The sort of person who emerges at a time of crisis that can save everyone. And that is, totalitarianism at its best. So I think that certainly totalitarian studies and the studies of politics within totalitarian regimes are necessary reading for today, are necessary investigations for today. I would also say that the racial implications of architecture, and along the way, and I mentioned an anecdote to you, along the way, I definitely encountered a lot of opposition to, no, but that's not, they don't really mean race. That's not what this is, not about race. And so I sought indirect reflections of the way that race is mirrored in the built environment. And I think that kind of investigation of the indirect ways in which our racial attitudes today are mirrored in our society, in our built environment, is a necessary study. So I think that parts of what I talked about were stylistic. That was pertaining to that particular time because of the level of control that was exerted over the public processes for the design and construction of buildings and the commissioning of artworks. But that may not be operative today or in other contexts. So it does require resituating that idea to the to contemporary dynamics. And now we have global economies, and we don't have the same kind of the lines of political force are different today. Nevertheless, how racial attitudes that we don't talk about and that exist in our culture are manifested in art, are manifested in culture, are manifested in the built environment, are incredibly relevant to investigation today. And I think those are the new avenues for research. I think that I mean, and as far as my own research, I threw away a whole chapter of this book, in doing a book. I didn't put everything in it. So there was a whole chapter about the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, which I showed an image of in the beginning. That's turning into a chapter that's going to be in a book soon. So I think that there are other contexts during this time that also are interesting ways to explore it. But in this particular case, I was interested in the trajectory that led from the declaration of empire, the politics that emerged into the war, and that full range, and having a projects that lived through that entire circumstance through the wartime. Having for a long time always wanted to write about what happens during architecture during the war, this was a perfect chance to kind of bring that into it, which again has relevance today. Perhaps maybe we could talk about architecture and war, and sort of. I guess now it's oligarchs and others that are, sort of leading the way. But I think that the problem of race in architecture in that context, of course, can be expanded, and I definitely hope others take it on. But I'm particularly interested in people looking at that in the contemporary way. It's not something I'm going to do, but it's something that I think is definitely ripe for research.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very insightful conversation. And above all, thank you for bringing our attention to the complexity of the interaction between politics and architecture and architectural policies, and including the issue of individual agency, which is pivotal, in my opinion. So now we can open the debate. For any question to the speakers, you can raise your virtual hand and we can start. And maybe we can, if you agree, we can gather some questions and let you reply. Okay. We can start with Francesco.
Yes, may I? Thank you. Thank you, Brian, for this important book and this fascinating presentation. And thank you, Hannah, for your stimulating points. And I have a lot of questions. Let's try these three questions. The first one about eugenics. I read your book and had the impression that when you use eugenics as a sort of metaphor or synonym of racial purification or racism. And I would like to ask some clarification on this point, on your notion of eugenics. As far as I know, Italian eugenics, the fascist eugenics, it was a specific kind of eugenics, an environmental, neo-Lamarckian eugenics, and was wondering if this is this specific Latin Catholic approach to eugenics provided a sort of particular way to build this interconnection between space, architecture, and the body of the nation, or the body of the individual. So my first question is on your idea of eugenics, so your use of the notion of eugenics in the book. My second point is talking about individuals, the big one, Mussolini, the Mussolini's role in your analysis. Recent historiography has stressed the creative and active role of Mussolini in implementing ideologically and politically racist racial policies in a fascist state. And on the other side, Mussolini had a fundamental role in the implementation of architectural policies during fascist, and his body and his role was fundamental in the process of the racial purification of the space, the very famous Pickett's blow, the first Pickett's blow as act of purification. So I would like to ask you a few words about the specific role of Mussolini in this intertwining, this interconnection between architecture and race. And the third point, very huge point, I am perfectly aware of it, but the debate between modernism and anti-modernism, which is fundamental in the historiography architecture, how this debate was affected by the intertwining between architecture and racial policies, specifically during the time your book is focused on, between the mid-30s and the war. Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much for the questions. They're really, really important. Yeah, I think definitely what you talked about, the sort of environmental dimension to the racial attitudes, that especially was formative on the discussion of the master planning, the idea of the site, the kind of spaces that were created, like the Annuale dell'Impero, like these moments where space was racialized because of a presentation that was entirely in conflict with the laws of the time. So there's a kind of strange spaces that were manifested within Italy, and it is sort of territorial, geographic, environmental, and it was a strong factor, especially in the formation of the master plans of these sites. I mean, to me, it's fascinating that, the Mostra del Mare, for example, is now a heritage site. It's a UNESCO heritage site because of the plants that were planted there, that were transplanted from Africa and are now on Italian soil. And that's the thing that is heritage, right? So heritage is soil, is plants. The same thing with the E42. I was flabbergasted to find out there was immense amount of documents talking about how various regions of Italy were donating trees that were brought and transplanted on that site. So the idea of it as Roman soil was a fabrication of this. Talk about making Italians, right? They made a place out of this accumulation of plant species that were brought from within the territorial boundaries of Italy. So that's a eugenic process, right? That's a eugenic making of space, and definitely tied to the longer standing racial theories, of course, that predated fascism, go back to the turn of the 20th century at the very least, and back into the 19th century. So I think it is a very important and characteristic element to the racial, the talking about race related to architecture. And that's why, for me, discussion of urban planning was really important to this project. I would only say that I wanted to as well address the style ideas of eugenics, as you said, metaphorically related to the stylistic control of art and building, the kind of debate that was going on in artwork at the time. That was sort of certain figures within the sort of racial theorist categories were coming out against modern art. The idea of modern art is Jewish and decadent. There was a criticism of the idea expressionism, like art should not be expression. It needs to come from something within, our nature, right? And it's foreign to Italians. Modern art has been imported from other places. We have other artistic traditions which we should follow, and similar sort of parallel thoughts in architecture, though architecture is a little different. But I think those eugenically, that is more the biological eugenics that wasn't as firmly established in fascist circles. There was more, that's the Nordic sort of racial theories that were not broadly prominent, but certainly impacted certain individuals at the time, and were Difesa della Razza specifically had those kind of eugenic arguments. But I think I tried to address both of those strains through different conversations about how architecture was impacted. The role of Mussolini is really interesting in particular, and it's true that he had this double role. Like you said, he was impactful on policy, but in the case, and those policies carried down and were in many cases were enacted by other individuals. However, he was also directly active in architecture. And I mentioned about the Palazzo del Littorio competition. I have this sort of famous document that has lists of Mussolini's pre-selected projects with his favorite project with a check mark beside it, basically. And guess what happened? It won. Surprise, surprise. And certainly others have written very convincing books about Mussolini and his connection to architecture, and the scholarship and the work on those is phenomenal. It's really convincing. So that part is unquestioned. I was especially interested in his active agency, these public ceremonies, these sort of creations of public spectacle, especially as related to the E42, these sort of visits to the site. Well, like you said, the pickaxe, the burying, in the Palazzo degli Uffici, they buried a container and it was blessed by a priest, and they buried something in the basement, in the basement of the building. Notably, there was also a gas chamber in the building. So they were thinking about, wartime problems. But yeah, he was, you know, the Luce films, the photographs, there was this public persona and performative aspect of Mussolini vis-a-vis the way that race was, you know, connected with place and site and with the toiling of the soil. And again, as I said in the latter part, the labor, the physical labor that was celebrated through these events, and all the photographs of laborers making these buildings, right? In some cases, very crude methods of construction, you know, so the scaffolding looked like, you know, not something you would expect, but these amazing buildings were done by hand and by the blood and sweat of individuals. And that represented the sort of the new fascist man as sort of laborer and soldier, right? So there were these kind of myths of fascism that Mussolini was part of concretizing through many of these events. And for me, that was really fascinating. The last one on the debate between modernism and anti-modernism, and I think that my argument would be that much of that debate took place in the early part of the 1930s. And what happened after 1936, and especially moving towards the wartime, is that debate was kind of sublimated almost entirely. Pagano being the only one that sort of vocally spoke out in some of his famous essays from Casabella, where he completely tore Piacentini to shreds in his criticism of the monumentalism of the E42, which was a project he did the master plan for, and suddenly he's saying, this is terrible, right? And so, in a sense, he was almost a lone voice in the echoing, in silence, because at that point in time, I wouldn't say that there wasn't internally debates within with architects within themselves about what does this modernism mean? Is this modernism? How do we continue to maybe fight against some of these tendencies? But it wasn't a vocal and public debate anymore. It had been sort of assimilated and suppressed largely, and things were moving on. And if you wanted to get work, you pretty much had to agree to the terms of the deal that came along with it. And that's what happened to the Palazzo delle Forze Armate eventually succumbed to the times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So other questions? I don't see other raised hands. Okay. Yes.
Good evening.
Giuliana, Tomas.
Grazie.
Please.
Good evening, and thank you for your presentation. If I remember well, speaking about a pavilion by Figini and Pollini, you spoke about the visualization of eugenetics. I'd like to understand better what you mean with visualization of eugenetics through architecture. And in particular, what's the difference between eugenetics through architecture and classical Roman Mediterranean architecture? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that in the case of the Palazzo delle Forze Armate, I think that the was mentioned before, part of it is the material changes that happen due to the consequences of the autarky campaign. That suddenly, and it's written in the letters by the architect complained about the fact that they had to design two projects, that basically they were awarded one project, they combined together, and then eventually, even after this, there was a whole process of changing the system of construction. And I think that if the analogy can be made, perhaps less the visualization of eugenics and more the eugenics became absorbed into the way of making the architecture. That is, it was made out of travertine columns. I had that photograph of the workers sort of, pushing around a travertine column. It shifted to bearing masonry from as a system of structure. And so the very material of architecture had been dictated, in a sense, to the architects, as opposed to what their original plans were. So the process of input and revision of the building, the adoption and the use of certain materials, all of those conceptually relate to a kind of eugenics within the body of architecture, I guess you would say, as opposed to the architects being controlled necessarily eugenically. But I think that that for me was an interesting thing, especially in going into the details of the construction of the building, that it was reshaped fundamentally by a process that is analogous to a kind of eugenic process. There's also actually I don't know if you know anything about the project by Alberto Libera, the Palazzo dei Congressi. There's a famous discussion about how essentially Piacentini did a sketch where he drew in a series of columns for the building that didn't have columns in it. And that in this case, literally the hand of another architect was imposing a vision of the building that was different from that of the architects that designed the project, in this case, Libera. And so I think that for Piacentini, the situation of that building at that particular place within the master plan demanded the presence of columns, which would properly mark out, the formality of the building relative to the urban space that led up to it. And so that is certainly essentially adding to the building an aesthetic that related to a kind of classicizing tendency. Now, similar things happened with the project by Figini Pollini and Di Renzi, but it was I haven't seen evidence of such a direct hand, right? But I think that if you look at the evolution of the project, there doesn't seem to be any mistake that was a demand for it to respond to similar types of aesthetic preferences on the part of the Ent E42 that was responsible for supervising the project, which was effectively Piacentini. So the same architect that drew columns on somebody else's project was also responsible for giving input on the evolution of this design as well.
Thank you. Other questions? Please note that you can also, if you like, you can ask your question in Italian too. Someone stepping forward. Otherwise, if I may, I have a question too concerning yes, the issue of eugenics and the complexity again of that issue. I specialize in the history of Roman Catholicism, so my question is about it, because I mean, there is in the book, I read some passages about the importance of the religious question in relation to your topic. But I would like to go, in depth about it by asking you if you think that there is a sort of Catholic alternative to modernist to the modernist project linking racial purification and politics through architecture. I mean, you know that mainstream Catholicism is against modernism in architecture, and there are some reference works from different personalities, in particular Celso Costantini, who is the secretary of the Propaganda Fide and an expert in missionary artworks, who wrote a sort of handbook concerning missionary art. And what is interesting that, if I remember well, it dates back to 1940. So it is a text which is the expression of the Holy See, in particular, the Vatican environment circles. But it is also a way to enter in the issue of colonial art in the Italian debate. And what is striking is that, okay, there is not an idea of biology-based racism and eugenics like the one of the Difesa della Razza, for example, but there is an idea of race-conscious art, because Costantini talks about the opportunity of a mitigated segregation between different neighborhoods, and as a result, different place of worship between whites and blacks in the colonies. So, I mean, there is a racial question inside the Catholic world too. I was wondering if you think that your work intersects also this issue. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the question. That's really interesting. And I'm definitely not familiar with this, but I would say that there were various arguments in the colonial context where religion was used as a basis for racial discrimination. So under the auspices of respect for other people's religious difference, creating separation, because that's what they would prefer, right? So I think in that context, the problem obviously is speaking for somebody else rather than actually, so it's a kind of reading of somebody else's culture that says that, well, Muslims desire to live in a different way, their sense of public and private are different from our own. So in order to respect their religion, we need to separate them. And we want to respect that religious difference. And so certainly under the auspices of mutual respect for religion, there is a hidden racial dimension. So I definitely understand that arguments that might be framed in terms of religion can mask other things, can mask other discriminations that are not expressed, right? They're not they're put in terms of mutual respect, but behind it, there's other motives that are not acknowledged, right? So I definitely am familiar. It's specifically with some of the urban planning. Certainly it happened in Libya under Balbo, who saw himself as a protector of Islam, and as Italy saw itself as generally as a protector of Islam and its colonies. But it opened up discriminations and also situations where obviously they're speaking for somebody else rather than asking them. It's interesting you mentioned the architecture of that might avoid this dynamic, right, that I was talking about. And actually, to a degree, when I was starting out this project, I was thinking about some of the most anonymous buildings from the fascist era, a number of which are actually nearby the Vatican that are actually, you know, buildings that, and they're these sort of background buildings. They all have travertine details around the windows, a certain scale of them. You look at them, you almost can't date them because they don't look like, you know that they're from the fascist era because of all the travertine, but otherwise they seek an almost anonymous presence in the city. And there was even the architect Gustavo Giovannoni, who was interested in this idea of local character and a sort of, they didn't call it indigenous architecture, but there's a longer interest in these sort of anonymous buildings that establish the character of a city that are not foreground and feature buildings. And I think that those, to be honest, are harder to talk about and to categorize. And I never eventually discussed those kind of buildings. And I do think that they might challenge the notion of this, is it modern? Is it, you know, the political aspects of fascism? And certainly in the city of Rome, they're all over the place. And they're all, again, sort of background buildings. And you can tell that they're built during that time, but they just don't, so I think, frankly, that's a whole area of investigation. It would be an interesting area of investigation that, again, I thought about early on, but I didn't end up seeking. But I think that would be an area to really probe in, because I don't think the answer to that question is really obvious. I don't think that it's clear whether how these relate to the whole discourse on architecture at that time, because arguably they are part of this longer tradition of these sort of background buildings that create a kind of environmental context in cities and towns throughout Italy. And they had a whole series of books, I'm spacing out the title right now, but that were, every region had a book that showed these kind of anonymous buildings in urban contexts. And I think that may be an answer to your question about, is there this other path? And it might be that there are some examples like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Other questions? So I don't know if there aren't further intervention. I think we can also conclude. Thank you very much for this very vibrant conversation. I really thank the speakers, first of all, also the audience for attending, and above all for the speakers for their willingness to meet our curiosity, and thank you so much. Concerning our next meeting, I don't know if I can say a few words about it. It will be in presence and in remote. It will be the seminar by Catherine Genti. Francesco, yes. Rewriting the history of modern medicine, lessons from the pandemic. It takes place on 25th March, 11 o'clock. And it is part of the seminar series, the COVID-19 pandemic in historical perspective. So see you next for this next seminar. Stay tuned, and thank you all of you for attending.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.